All right, we're a little after 3:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pass it off to Michelle of KDADS for some introductions.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. We're excited to welcome you to our final town hall. Appreciate everybody coming. Can you change the slide? Okay, there we go. Caroline Hockenberry is the meeting schedule. Jackie Merriweather will talk about self-direction, and Katie will talk about some other CSW updates. And I will turn it back to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Michelle. So here's a slide of our agenda for the day. We're in the middle of our welcome right now. Then we'll talk about the schedule for the community support waiver and some next steps. We'll go over some self-direction updates, which includes more information, and some further CSW updates before we end with a wrap-up from Katie. Next slide, please. Making sure folks can hear me. For the meeting schedule, we wanted to point out that today is our last town hall meeting, so thank you for attending throughout the year and for all of your input. This will go up online, the recording and other materials, once we're finished here. So here are the next steps for the CSW. There will be an official tribal and public comment period, which will involve both in-person and virtual opportunities, so stay tuned for more information on that. There will also be a legislative review before submitting to CMS, which is expected to happen in spring of 2026. There will also be operational changes, and that will involve creating CSW-specific policies, MMIS and IT updates, education and training for partners, provider enrollment, and more. Throughout all of this, KDADS will continue to seek and accept your feedback on the CSW. And if you'd like to find out more information, we have all sorts of details about collecting your feedback on the CSW website. Next slide, please. Great. I would love to pass it off to Jackie at this point, who's going to go over some CSW self-direction updates.
Thanks, Caroline. All right, so there have been some changes to self-direction on the CSW, so I want to update you all on that. So based on feedback from stakeholders, KDADS has decided to limit self-direction to 5 services on the CSW just initially. So the 5 services that will be allowed to be self-directed will be personal care services, respite, non-medical transportation, family caregiver support and training, and individual directed goods and services. So previously, every service on the CSW was going to allow for self-direction, but moving forward for the initial period of the CSW, these 5 services will be allowed to be self-directed. So KDADS decided this to ease partners' operational concerns and ensure clarity for participants. KDADS can always reassess at a later date if they want to expand the opportunities for self-direction, if stakeholders want some more opportunities for self-direction after the initial implementation of the CSW. So now I have some slides on the implications for removing self-direction from some of the services that previously were going to allow for self-direction. So there were a number of new services that are going to be offered on the CSW. They're listed here on this slide and include assistive technology, remote supports, career exploration and planning, individual employment support services, benefits planning, and life skill services. Some of these are completely new to Kansas. Others are currently being unbundled from the day support services on the IDD waivers. So for example, individual employment support services, technically a new service, but will look similar to supported employment that folks are used to on the IDD waiver. So for this group of new services, one of the reasons that you might allow for self-direction is to allow participants to sort of expand the existing MCO provider networks and choose a provider outside of one of those established MCO provider networks. Given that these are new services, KDADS wants the provider network to get established with MCOs prior to determining whether expanding beyond the MCO's provider network is necessary. So what it means to remove self-direction for these services, participants on the CSW can only get these services through an agency that's contracted with a managed care organization. And then the rate that providers are reimbursed is set by the MCO or determined through the MCO bid process. For example, like assistive technology equipment and installation, the price will vary depending on what assistive technology equipment it will be. So that price for that will be determined through the MCO bid process. This is another list of services that previously were going to be offered through self-direction, but now will no longer be. Behavior therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, home telehealth, medication reminder services, and personal emergency response systems. So one of the reasons to allow for self-direction, like we said on the last slide, is to allow for folks to choose providers outside of the MCO network and also allow participants to negotiate the rate that they want to pay for the service. Given the required provider qualifications for these services, like the therapy services and more medical-based services, participants may not realistically be able to negotiate rates with these types of providers. So if necessary, KDADS will consider expanding self-direction opportunities for these services to expand the provider network beyond the providers that are currently established in the MCO networks. But initially for the CSW, these services will not be self-directed. So what does it mean to remove self-direction? CSW participants will only be able to get these services through an agency that's contracted with an MCO. And then providers will be reimbursed the agency rate. Last group of services that will no longer be offered through self-direction are home modifications, vehicle modifications, and specialized medical equipment and supplies. So as we said, one of the reasons for allowing for self-direction is to allow participants to select a provider that's not contracted with an MCO. So how it's set up in Kansas currently is that even without self-direction, participants have the option to refer desired providers to a Center for Independent Living to become a provider. And the service rate is then determined through a bid process. So removing self-direction for these services doesn't really limit a participant's ability to choose what they pay for the service because it's going to go through the bid process. And it doesn't really limit a participant's ability to select who they want to provide the service because they can always refer their desired provider to contract with a Center for Independent Living and receive the services that way. So again, what it means to remove self-direction for these services, CSW participants will be able to receive these services either through a provider who's contracted with an MCO or a provider who subcontracts with the Center for Independent Living. And then the rate for the service will be determined by the MCO bid process. So to reiterate, the services that do have self-direction opportunities on the CSW, those are personal care services, respite, family caregiver support and training, and non-medical transportation. So what does it mean to allow for self-direction of these services? Participants can hire an individual to deliver the service, set their wage for their hired staff, train staff, and terminate staff. When a participant on the CSW self-directs one of these services, they're going to receive help from the FMS to collect the appropriate taxes and process payroll. They're also going to receive help from a support broker to learn how to be an effective employer and set an appropriate wage for their staff. And then the last service that's allowable for self-direction is individual directed goods and services, often shortened to IDGS. So what does it mean to self-direct this service? So IDGS is a service where participants can purchase an item or good or service that isn't already available through another waiver service. That item or good does have to meet the requirements that are established in the IDGS service definition. A reminder that we do have the service definitions posted on the CSW website if you want to go and read that service definition. But essentially, there's some points there about how the item or good has to address the participants' needs and goals that are established in their service plan. They can't just choose to purchase anything they want. But as long as it meets those points in the service definition about addressing one of their needs or goals in their service plan, then they have the opportunity to purchase a good or item that's not otherwise provided through the waiver. When a participant self-directs individual directed goods and services, the participant will receive help from a support broker, and the support broker will help the participant decide how much to pay for each item or service within their budget. And then the FMS would purchase the item or service on behalf of the participant using their budget funds. And then one more update on self-direction. Previously, we had presented that participants who decided they wanted to stop self-directing their services would have to give the TCM and FMS 10 days notice to arrange for alternative service provision. KDAD's received some feedback that 10 days notice would not be long enough for alternative service provision. So they've updated the CSW waiver draft to say that participants must give 30 days notice to the TCM and the FMS when they want to stop self-directing their services. All right, I'm going to pause here to see if folks have any questions on these self-direction updates. And Peter, I'll ask you to help me out with the Q&A. If there's been any questions.
Jackie, there was a comment in the chat about someone having trouble seeing the interpreter. You see that?
I think we've just pinned them now. We have the interpreters, they switched off, but hopefully you can see them now, but let us know.
Jackie, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we don't have any questions quite yet, but we do invite people to send them in as they have them. Oh, here's one, actually, just as I say that. From Linda Tom. Does the person helping someone self-direct receive payment from the $20,000?
They do not. So if you're talking about like the FMS and the support broker who provide assistance to the participant who's self-directing, They are paid separately by KDADS using administrative funds. So getting those supports won't come out of a participant's $20,000 budget cap.
Thank you. We do have another question from Jeff Stitt asking, how does this fit in if someone is in a conservatorship? Do you know, Jackie?
I don't know all of the details of that. Jeff, what I do know is that essentially if somebody is self-directing, they can choose a designated representative to self-direct for them. So for example, if they're a child and their parent or other legal guardian wants to be the designated representative who determines the wage for the hired staff, hires the staff, etc., that can happen. I don't know more details about specifically conservatorships, though. I don't know if, Michelle, you have anything else to add there.
No, I think you gave accurate information, Jackie, and they can
Okay.
act as their designated representative.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both. No more questions have come in. Maybe we give it just a little more time. And then I know you're going to continue talking about this topic, Jackie, so people can always submit in the next question period if that works for you.
Absolutely.
Sounds good. I'm not seeing anything come in, so perhaps we proceed and do more topical questions in like 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Thanks.
So those were the updates on self-direction, but we've gotten a lot of questions about self-direction. And so in this section, I'm just going to go over some more information, sort of answering some of the frequently asked questions that we get about self-direction. None of this information is necessarily new or represents changes. It's just to sort of reiterate. So one of the questions that we often get is, why would a CSW participant want to use self-direction? So CSW participants may want to use self-direction if they want to hire their own staff to deliver one of the following services. So they want to hire their own staff to deliver personal care services, respite, family caregiver support and training, or non-medical transportation. They also might want to self-direct if they want sort of the flexibility to hire their own staff, but then set a wage for their staff. Now, the state will have a range that folks can choose between when they're setting a wage for the services listed here. And then somebody also might want to use self-direction if they want to purchase a good or service that's not already provided through a waiver service. And just noting again that they can't purchase any good or service, it does have to align with their assessed needs. Another common question is about self-direction on the CSW versus IDD waiver. So just to make it clear, self-direction will look slightly differently on the CSW than you might be used to on the IDD waiver. So on the CSW, participants don't get to choose from multiple FMS agencies. The state is going to contract with one FMS agency that will provide FMS to all CSW participants. What you might be used to on the IDD waiver is that FMS is set up like a waiver service where there's multiple options and the participant selects which provider they want to work with out of the different options. So that will be one change from the CSW compared to the IDD waiver. Another is that participants self-directing their services will have help from a support broker on the CSW. And on the IDD waiver, participants don't typically have help from a support broker. On the CSW, participants can choose the wage that they'll pay for self-directed services, so long as it's within the state's limits. On the IDD waiver, participants don't get to pick the wage paid for self-directed services. The state has an established rate for when a service is self-directed. And then on the CSW, participants with an assessed need for a good or service not available through other waiver services can purchase that good or service. So that's the individual directed goods and services. That is not an option on the IDD waiver. So participants don't get to purchase goods or services with their budget funds on the IDD waiver, and are only can only get the established services through the IDD waiver. Whereas on the CSW, if a participant has a need for a good or service not already included in the list of waiver services, they could potentially receive that through individual directed goods and services. Another common question we get is about how will service planning look for CSW participants. So a CSW participant can receive up to $20,000 of services in a year. That's the legislatively established cap. Now, developing the service plan is really a core function of targeted case management. So on the CSW, TCMs will manage each participant's total service utilization and ensure that the amount of services that a person is receiving, so that's all of their agency services plus all of their self-directed services that are included and authorized in that service plan, stays within that $20,000 annual cap. KDADS has heard some feedback from stakeholders who are worried that this is new. Operating a waiver with this sort of $20,000 cap or any cap is new to Kansas. And so KDADS has heard that feedback and will incorporate additional training to teach partners like TCMs, MCOs, etc., how to operate when a waiver does have an annual cap like this. Now, service planning steps for self-directing CSW participants. So all CSW participants are going to go through the same service planning process, but if a participant chooses to self-direct their services, there are just a couple additional steps for them. So all CSW participants are going to complete an inner REI needs assessment with their MCO care coordinator. All CSW participants are going to develop a person-centered service plan with their TCM. And then, of course, all of the CSW participants are going to choose their providers with the help from their CDDO. Now, there are a couple additional steps only for CSW participants who do want to self-direct their services. So if a participant is self-directing their services, they'll also get connected to a support broker who will provide the participant with training on self-direction, will support them in hiring their employees and sort of acting as an employer. And then the support broker will help them develop a spending plan, which will document, what wages they're going to pay their staff, and if they're receiving individual directed goods and services, how much they're going to spend on those items. Now, the TCM is going to review that spending plan to ensure that it aligns with the person's service plan. Often getting some questions on support brokers too, so just want to reiterate sort of what the support broker role is. So support brokers are there to provide information and assistance for participants who opt to use self-direction. So if a CSW participant is not self-directing their services, which means they only receive agency services and they don't use any IDGS, the individual directed goods and services, then they're not connected to a support broker. So if you're self-directing your services and hiring your own staff to provide the service, you'll need to establish a wage that you want to pay your hired staff. And the support broker is really there to help participants make these decisions. And then self-directing participants who do have a need for an individual directed good or service, the IDGS, will work with the support broker to determine the cost for the item or service that they want to purchase, and then ensure that it's within their authorized amount. All right, so opening it up for more questions on self-direction.
All right, we have a bunch of questions that have come in. Many of them are on the topic of support brokers, so I think we should start there. Martha Boatwright asks, who will be the support brokers? Do they get hired through agencies, KDADs? Some people were wondering about the connection to FMS. How does that work?
Yeah, great question. So the support brokers will be hired and employed by the FMS agency. So KDADS is going to contract with an FMS agency who will have support brokers on their staff to provide that sort of one-on-one assistance with participants.
Great. Thanks so much. We also have some questions about goods and services. Trisha Waring asks, can you please provide an example of a good or service?
Yeah, it's hard to provide exact examples because it might be dependent on, right, the participants' needs. We've seen in other states that they'll approve a variety of different things, and it will be sort of up to KDADs and the participant and their support team of their TCM and MCO care coordinator to determine if the good or service is an assessed need. But some examples could be anything that potentially like reduces the need for in-person staff. So sometimes we've seen in other states that folks will be able to purchase like a microwave or some sort of cooking appliance that helps them live more independently and independently cook meals in their home. Other types of things that we've seen other states approve through this service are like equine therapy, maybe like some sort of summer camp or something that helps a participant work on their social skills or employment skills or something like that. So I don't want to promise like this will always be approved or this won't be approved because it's still sort of being worked out. But those are some examples of how other states have approved items through this service. It'll all be dependent on what the participants' assessed needs are and sort of what their goals are. And that's included in their service plan.
Thanks, Jackie. That's really helpful. Kayla Taylor asked along similar lines about the relationship between these goods and services and DME, which is durable medical equipment, correct? So are these goods and services things that cannot be ordered through DME?
Correct. So part of the service definition for individual directed goods and services is that you can't get this item or good through any other service. So if you can get the item or good through durable medical equipment, specialized medical equipment or supplies, assistive technology, then that's how you would get the good. Individual directed goods and services is only for items that you can't get through any other waiver service.
Thank you. People are also asking about conflicts of interest in different contexts. Lisa Childers asks, will there be conflict of interest guidelines for support brokers?
So conflict of interest often is talked about on HCBS waivers to ensure that somebody who is developing a service plan isn't also providing the service and getting paid for the service. So that there isn't an incentive for a service provider to develop a service plan that includes services that that provider delivers, or they don't develop a service plan to include more services than what's actually needed in order to make money. So that's kind of how we talk about conflict of interest in terms of waivers. Like, are people making money off of services, the ones who are developing a service plan? Now, support brokers will be employed by the state contracted FMS provider, and they won't be delivering any direct waiver services. So they won't be providing personal care services directly, or respite directly, non-medical transportation directly. So I don't know that there's any conflict of interest concerns there that need to be addressed. But if somebody has additional questions on that, or I didn't answer that correctly or fully, let me know.
Will do. Thanks, Jackie. We also have some people wondering about TCMs and trainings. Colleen Hunter asks, do TCMs need to do anything more than attend trainings in order to be able to do TCM under this new waiver?
So you'll have to be licensed just how you're, already licensed on any other waiver, and then complete the training requirements. And I know, Michelle, you have indicated that KDADS is going to sort of update some of that training requirements for TCMs, but I'm not aware of any additional things beyond getting licensed how you're normally licensed as a TCM, and doing your mandatory training. Michelle, am I missing anything?
No, I think that's about right. We are contracting with UMKC and charting the life course to help us with our training for TCM for the CSW waiver.
Thanks. Is there a limit to how many people will have the option to self-direct?
There's no limit. So anybody on the CSW can self-direct if they want to. There's not a specific limit.
Fabulous. Thank you. Martha Boatwright asked, will the cap be adjusted for inflation? I'm guessing that's referring to the $20,000 cap.
We don't see that happening unless the legislature decides to do that. Some states have their rates adjusted for inflation every year. Kansas does not do that.
Thanks, Michelle. Back to TCM trainings, Colleen Hunter asks, when can we expect those? Do we have that on the timeline quite yet, Jackie?
Not that I know of, unless Michelle, I think it's still in development, unless you have a timeline that you know of.
Yeah, we're desperately trying to get it posted. It's having to go through a lot of reviews right now, but we hope to have it posted very soon. And then it'll be on the Department of Administration's website.
Perfect. Good to know where people can keep their eyes peeled
Yes.
for that information.
Yeah.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. What will the process be for selecting the one FMS for all CSW participants?
So that in Kansas, whenever we put an RFP out, there are a lot of guidelines around the competitive bid process. You have to meet certain criteria to bid on a contract. And then we have a team that will review all of the RFPs and then make a selection based on that criteria.
Okay. Thank you for outlining the process. All right. Some more questions. All right. This one has multiple parts, so please let me know if you need me to repeat anything. but this is from Jeff Stitt. He asks, is there a cap on the services provided by IDD? Then what happens if someone hits the CSW cap? Do their services end? Would you like me to read the rest of the question or to start with those two?
Jackie, do you want to start? Janet doesn't know.
Yeah, just got a message that my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if you can't hear me or anything.
I can hear you.
Great. So is there a cap on services provided by IDD?
Now it's cutting out.
So I'll go ahead and
Thanks, Michelle.
get your internet connection. So is there a cap on services? The legislature for this particular waiver has a $20,000 overall cap for the year. When a person decides to go on the CSW waiver, they'll have to work within that budget for the entire year. So that's something that they would work with their PCN and support broker if they're self-directing any services. We really want a very robust education center system before you actually decide to go on the CSW, letting you know that it is designed not to meet for people that do not need 24-hour support. So we'll be working with our CDDOs to help establish that, so that if people decide that they make a good decision as to whether the CSW will meet their needs.
Thank you.
And I see Jeff responded about what if they're on the IDD waiver. So the IDD waiver is slightly different than the CSW and doesn't have the $20,000 cap. And then what happens if somebody hits the CSW cap? Do their services end? Jeff, you had asked. So you can't receive more than $20,000 worth of services in a year. When you're going through the service planning process, your targeted case manager is going to help you build a plan so that you know what services you'll get throughout the year. You'll likely, if you need more than $20,000 of services, the targeted case manager then is going to help you decide what sort of natural supports exist in your life who can meet that need for you, or help refer you to other community resources that aren't a part of the waiver to sort of meet those needs. The plan will be set up so that it is for the full year. So you'll be kind of helped to manage to make sure that you don't use all your 20,000 in month one and then have no sort of support the rest of the year. So that will be kind of part of the service planning process that each CSW participant will go through.
Thanks, Jackie. We're going to wrap the rest of Jeff's questions and then move on to Katie's part of the presentation. Thank you to everyone who's submitting these fabulous questions. We'll just need to advance, but if we have time at the end, we will come back and address these. But for the rest of Jeff's question, he asked if someone can be on the IDD and CSW at the same time.
No, Jeff, you cannot. So you can only be on one waiver program at a time. So you'd have to either choose to be on the IDD waiver if there's a spot open, or on the CSW.
Thanks. And the last part of his question asks if a service animal can be provided as part of their plan on the CSW.
Michelle, I want to check to see if you have any information, but I think he might be referring to, like, can you use IDGS, like an individual directed good and service, to purchase like a service animal or train a service animal or something? I don't know the answer to that. Do you know any more than I do?
I don't. So I think that's something we'd have to take back and see if that's ever a possibility with the individual prison services.
Thank you all for your great answers. And just a reminder, too, that you can always email us using the email that I'm about to drop into the chat, but also it's featured on our website. But we're going to pass it on to Katie for the next phase of our presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Caroline. We are going to zoom out a little bit from self-direction and share some other updates about the CSW. First up, we have an update that KDADS has posted the CSW rates based on its rate study, and you can find that information on the rates at this link on the website, which is now in the chat thanks to Peter. If you scroll down on that page, you will see a lot of resources in addition to the rate information, such as service definitions and a comparison of the services offered on the IDD waiver versus the CSW. In terms of the rate information, though, you're going to see a video of a presentation describing the methodology of the rate buildups and more detail about the rates for each service that are going to be offered on the CSW. If you have feedback on the methodology, the rates, or anything on the page, you can email us at kansascsw@pcgus.com or using the feedback form on the website as well. Or of course, you're welcome to provide public comment at that time. As you guys know, there is the $20,000 cap that we've been discussing. And with these rates, you can now determine the maximum of a service that could be authorized under the CSW, which we're going to come back to in a moment after the next slide. Just a status update before we keep going, to share that KDADS is continuing now shifting in towards implementation and is working with KDHE and other departments to create kind of the billing procedures and establish billing practices. All right, if you go to the next slide, Jackie. So getting back to what I was mentioning before about understanding that $20,000 cap, let me introduce you to this web page, which is the participant profile page, which will also drop into the chat now. Thanks, Peter. This page includes 8 fictional examples that are intended to illustrate who might be a good fit for the CSW and who would not be. What types of services are going to be available in the CSW, and also to help convey how much can be afforded within that $20,000 annual budget. Want to acknowledge that the CSW won't be the right fit for everyone, and this webpage is intended to help people understand who may be a good fit for the CSW. All right, I'm gonna pause again for questions, and these, Caroline, can include those that we didn't get to earlier or if there are new ones.
All right, let's have a look. So these questions really range about the whole presentation, but an anonymous attendee asks, when will the RFP for FMSs be released?
I'll let Michelle take that one.
Yeah, so we are diligently working on getting that released. It does have to go through a number of systems analysts within the state. And so we are hoping to release that very soon. We've gone through most of the hurdles so far, but we think we have one more we're still trying to get through. And I think I said earlier that when it is ready, it will be posted on the Department of Administration website.
Thanks, Michelle. We have another FMS question. An anonymous attendee asks, will the FMS fee come out of the participant's budget?
No, because it's such a low cap, we decided to make this an administrative service. So we're going to be paying the FMS provider outside of the plan of service. So you will not be paid for FMS or for support broker services.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have a timeline question. When is the CSW waiver going live? Adam Zamora asks.
Sure. And this, oh, go ahead, Michelle. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Katie, do you want to, okay. I was just gonna say that our goal is we are aiming for October 1st, 2026. We have a timeline directed at that. There are some factors we don't control, that we will be, submitting to CMS early in the spring. They have 6 months to review it. So we're really hopeful. We've done all the prep work, and they won't have a lot of, things they want us to correct before they'll approve it. We also have, as we indicated, a lot of operational back end things that we have to get set up in the, before we can actually go live. But we're working on a plan to meet that 10/1 date.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. It'll be so exciting to see it come together.
Yeah.
A question from Michelle Alam. She asks, where will PERS and remote monitoring fall within CSW's final service code structure? Is it listed separately from assistive technology, home enabling services, or participant-directed goods and services? I'm not sure who the best person would be to take that question.
We do have them set up as separate services. So there should be, as KDES is working through like creating the codes, there'll likely be different billing codes for those. So personal emergency response systems, which is PERS or PERS, that'll be a separate service. Assistive technology would be a separate service. Remote supports would be a separate service. I can't remember if there's any others that I missed there, but you can also see all of the distinctions in services and read the specific definitions if you go to the CSW website, and there's a tab called services.
Thanks, Jackie. Michelle was also asking about where rates can be found, and Peter mentioned in the chat that rates are available toward the top of that page as well. So be sure to check out the website for more information. I believe that is most questions. I did want to reiterate Sean's question, which was answered in the chat. He asked, will this recording be public? And the answer is yes. We are recording this now and we'll upload it to our public website, and the URL is in the chat. So you can find it there in the near future. I know we have about 10 minutes, so if you have any additional questions before we wrap up, please send them in now. We have another question from Michelle that just came in. What is the process for moving someone between the comprehensive IDD waiver and CSW? And how is continuity of tech supports like PERS protected during those transitions? Jackie, is that best for you?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. If Michelle or others have things that I missed, feel free to jump in. So if somebody's currently on the IDD waiver and they decide, hey, I want to switch over to the CSW, what they can do is talk to their targeted case manager or their local CDDO and say, hey, I have interest in actually switching to the CSW. Now, the CDDO and the targeted case manager, likely also your MCO care coordinator, are going to support you through that transition to make sure that your services don't just stop all of a sudden. PERS is something like is a service that's offered on the IDD waiver and the CSW. So there's potential that you could potentially, stay with the same service provider if they're also a service provider on the CSW for that service. But all of that sort of gets worked out, transitioning to a new waiver and determining who your new providers are going to be, what services you're going to receive on the new waiver, would all happen through sort of a new service planning process. to get you a service plan set up through the CSW.
Great. Thanks for laying that out, Jackie. We have a question about the number of slots on the waiver. How many are there for this first year?
So the legislature has provided KDADs with funding for 500 slots on the CSW. If for some reason the CSW gets filled with 500 individuals, the legislature would have to then, provide additional funding to increase the number of spots. And that could be a potential. But initially, the cap on number of spots is 500 individuals.
Thank you, Jackie. A question from an anonymous attendee about career exploration and individual employment support. Someone mentioned, or someone asked, are those being left out of the CSW for now?
Both of those will be on the CSW. So career exploration and planning, which is about helping individuals sort of discover what careers they want to go into, help them look for jobs, learn how to make a resume, etc. That will be a service on the CSW. And then individual employment support services, which is really about once a person has a job, sort of that on-the-job coaching to maintain that job, that will also be included as a service on the CSW.
Great, thank you. So those are reflected in the service profiles that we have online. Awesome. People are wondering about the process of potentially moving back and forth between waivers. Sue Stevens asks, what happens if the person moves to the CSW, then finds it isn't right for them? What is the process for them to switch back to the comprehensive IDD waiver?
So KDADS has a policy currently that for their IDD waiver that sets up the level of prioritization of who gets a spot on the IDD waiver. So if you are on the CSW, you can't also be on the IDD waiver waitlist. So if you're already receiving services on the CSW and then something changes in your life to where you decide this doesn't meet my needs anymore, you could potentially unenroll from the CSW and join the IDD waiver waitlist. You would be on the bottom of the waitlist then, unless you had some circumstance to meet the crisis definition. So for the IDD waiver policy that KDADS has established, if you meet the definition of like crisis, you can bypass the IDD waiver waitlist and join the IDD waiver. There's also what we call reserved capacity. So there's some reserved slots on the IDD waiver for specific populations. If you meet one of those, then you could potentially bypass the waitlist. So you would have to unenroll from the CSW, join the IDD waiver waitlist, unless you met the crisis definition or had a reserved capacity for certain those targeted sort of populations.
Thank you for speaking to that, because we did have a question about a catastrophe situation, so appreciate that. Question from Lisa Childers again. Does an individual have to be eligible for institutionalization to qualify for CSW?
So the eligibility requirements are the same as the IDD waiver, meaning that you have to meet a level of care of, I'm forgetting the acronym right now. The Michelle or others help me out. It's
Empathy.
essentially,
What are you thinking of, Jackie?
essentially like, yes, an institution for individuals with IDD.
I see. That's what you're looking for.
Sorry, say that again.
ICF, IDD.
Yes. Yes. institutional care facility for individuals with IDD, ICF-IID. So that is like the level of care that's needed to be met to be eligible for this waiver, the same level of care that is required to be on the IDD waiver as well.
Thank you. A question from Melanie about wait lists. Is this still true if on CSW and you need to go back to the IDD that you would go to the bottom of the wait list?
Yes, unless you met the crisis exception policy definition. So if there was some sort of catastrophe or crisis, you could potentially bypass the wait list. Or if you met the qualifications for one of those reserved capacity slots. Those are the only two instances in which you could bypass the wait list. Otherwise, you would go to the end of the IDD waiver wait list.
Thanks so much. I think that about puts us at our time for questions, but just a reminder that you can always email us your questions using the email address featured here on the slide, or you can submit your feedback through the form on the website. We really appreciate your participation in these meetings and your input in general as we've been putting together the waiver. But I'll hand it off to Katie to wrap things up.
Thanks, Caroline. I think you covered most of it. I just want to reiterate what Caroline mentioned at the start of the meeting, that this is the last town hall before public comment on our current timeline. So we've dropped the link to the website a few times, or different pages of the website anyway, in the chat a few times. And please continue to check back there for the latest updates and information. Everything will be shared there. We do want to express, like Caroline said, to our sincere appreciation for your participation. And if anything occurs to you, questions, comments, feedback of any kind, our website and our email address are both listed here.